This is the last interview given by Lyndon Baines Johnson, 36th President of the United States. It was held 10 days before his death at the LBJ Ranch in Texas. The subject was one dear to Mr. Johnson, a towering achievement of his administration, the struggle for civil rights.
A lot of people say if you hadn't had all this civil rights legislation, we'd never had this problem. We'd have had more than we could even dream of if we hadn't had. If we've had them with it, you can imagine what we'd have had if we had continued to sit on that dynamite keg.
A month before, the president had come to the LBJ Library at the University of Texas in Austin to greet civil rights leaders, black and white, from all over the country. The library held a symposium to mark the opening of the president's civil rights papers. Of the 31 million Johnson papers housed here, 1 million deal with civil rights. In the library, Lyndon Johnson's 3 legislative milestones in civil rights. 1964, the act which prohibited discrimination in public accommodations and strengthened school desegregation and fair employment. 1965, voting rights gave the federal government the power to enforce laws giving minorities the most precious right, the right to vote. 1968, housing prohibited discrimination in the sale or rental of most housing in the United States. 3 acts and a surge in the civil rights movement unparalleled since Reconstruction. There were new faces and there were old faces too. Former Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren. Former Vice President, Senator Hubert Humphrey. Roy Wilkins, Executive Director, NAACP. And 2 newly elected congresswomen from California, Yvonne Brathwaite Burke, and from Texas, Barbara Jordan. The president had braved a Texas ice storm to be here, and he stayed through the long day and evening. The next day, a threatened disruption. Some black factions demanded time to speak, claiming the meeting was unrepresentative. The president gave them permission to speak. Roy Innes, director of CORE, was given 5 minutes.
Chairman.
He was joined by the Reverend A. Kendall Smith, New York City Council of Churches Task Force on Racism. The president told me later both men had received invitations to attend the symposium.
New York Task Force on Racism.
Then Clarence Mitchell, Washington director, NAACP, rose to his feet.
I knew when I saw Roy walk in there, and I saw the deployment of his forces, what was going to happen. Because I have been through this before, and it is only out of the courtesy of a great president of the United States that this gentleman has had an opportunity to be heard. It seems to me this is what is the challenge of leadership. Because President Johnson has the courage to come out in Texas and speak against white demagoguery, whereas I'm going to come out and speak against black demagoguery.
The president, drawn and fatigued, came back to the rostrum. The disruption was over.
Should I close the prayer?
No.
Okay.
No, you go on.
We'll handle it. We'll arrange our own prayer.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is yours.
A month to the day later, the president spoke with me. This hour is the last interview with the 36th President of the United States.
I never thought that I would awaken and find myself in the position of power that a president has. But I am here, and I have it, and I'm going to use it to try to correct what I know and genuinely believe are injustices toward my fellow man. And I didn't do as much as I wanted to do, but I did more than had been done up to that time.
Mr. President, at the recent Civil Rights Symposium at Austin, when your civil rights papers were opened, you made a lot of interesting statements, but one in particular I'd like to mention here now. You said,
I do not want to say that I've always seen this matter in terms of the special plight of the black man. As clearly as I came to see it in the course of my life and experience and responsibility.
how did you come to see it at some point? What was the moment of revelation?
I don't know that I can pinpoint a day or time or an hour. I think that we're all the products of our environment. And here on the Pedernales, we did not grow up in any prejudiced atmosphere. This area is populated by Germans who immigrated here 100 years ago. We have few, if any, black citizens. Although when I was a child, 3 or 4 years old, I grew up with Mexican Americans and they were my playmates. But like most other citizens of this country, I took my own rights for granted, and I did not see and feel and was not as concerned with my fellow man as I later became as my service extended itself and as I became more acquainted with the problems of the land. When I was a young man, I taught in a Mexican-American school, and there I got my real deep first impressions of the prejudices that existed and the inequity of our school system between whites and browns. Later, I was an NYA administrator and dealt with the poverty groups. Many young people in the NYA were blacks and browns, and I saw the inequalities of our system then. Later, as a young congressman, when I was a candidate, and I would go campaigning in my district, when I finished my speech, all the people come through, shake hands with me. The whites would come through first, the blacks would stand aside waiting their turn, and I remember on occasion or two I was criticized severely for asking the blacks to come through and shake hands with them. They felt that I was extending to them a privilege that they shouldn't have. Very few were voting in Texas in those days because we had a poll tax that helped to disenfranchise them, and they were not encouraged to vote. But as they participated in the elections and I saw their problems and got to know them through my work and teaching in my early years in Congress, I think I gradually took on a different viewpoint. As Vice President, dealing with the cause of the minorities and trying to evaluate their problems and find a solution to them, no doubt gave me a breadth of understanding and vision I hadn't had before. And finally, when I became president and realized that I was the leader of the country and that I was the president of all the people, and all the people were looking to me to correct the inequalities and inequities and injustices, and there was something that I could do about it. I concluded that now that I have the power, I'm going to use it every way I could. And of course, most of my efforts that brought fruit were during the time when I had the power of the presidency behind me.
By 1937, you had been elected to Congress. Was it difficult for you to reconcile the problem of representing a constituency in Texas with the need, your new felt need to take a stand on civil rights?
First, I didn't have the power to do much about it as an individual congressman of 435. But I did not enthusiastically exercise the power I did have because, first of all, I couldn't have done much about it. And second of all, I was not aware of the extent of the overall injustices that was practiced upon them as a young congressman that I later realized as a leader of the nation in the Senate and as vice president and president.
At Gettysburg in 1963, when still vice president, you said this:
Until justice is blind to color, until all education is unaware of race, until opportunity is unconcerned with the color of men's skins, emancipation will be a proclamation, but emancipation will not be a fact.
Wasn't that just about as strong a statement as you'd ever made up to that point?
Perhaps. I think that's still true. I thought it was very true then. We've made a lot of progress, but we haven't made near enough. And education is not blind to color in this country, and justice is not unaware of race, and it'll take us decades to try to bring the white man, the black man, the brown man on equal footing in all of these fields. But there's no question but what a great many people felt that when we had the Emancipation Proclamation, we had made great steps forward, and we had. But we had not solved our problems, and 100 years went by, and we'd done very little about it. Now, we have had a rapid advancement in the period of the 60s, and I hope we'll have in the 70s. But I believe that's a strong statement. I intended it to be strong, but I think it's an accurate statement.
You wrote in your book, The Vantage Point, that about that moment when you became president of the United States, and truly the top leader of all the people, and you said, just when the blacks had their hopes for equality and justice raised, after centuries of misery and despair, they awoke one morning to discover their future in the hands of a president born in the South. Well, do you think they really felt that way after all you'd been doing in the almost 10 years previously, or at least the 6 years previously, since 57?
Yes, I'm sure that they have a feeling toward a Southerner, and they have doubts. They had them then, and I think they have them now. And they may be justified in some regards, because I was the product of an environment and an area that was had never been particularly aggressive in ridding them of some of these injustices perpetrated upon them. And I can understand their viewpoint, although I have no complaint about the treatment of me as president. I frequently disagreed with the methods and the procedure and the manner that we went about things. And we had our differences with Mr. Wilkins and Mr. Young, Dr. King, and others on what decision I ought to make, certainly on the war and things of that nature. But they were respectful, and they were reasoning, and they were fair with me, and any leadership I provided to make advancements in their field, they supported and effectively supported it.
Well, in 64, of course, that was the year of the great filibuster that you finally had to break, going against your own feelings, as you told us earlier in this talk. There were for unlimited debate. What brought you to that decision that you finally communicated then to Senator Russell that this time there would be no compromise?
Well, Senator Russell, I think, understood that from the day I became president. I recall Senator Russell made a speech early in my presidency that was somewhat prophetic. He said he knew that I felt certain things deeply, and he expected me to move in certain areas, and then when I moved, I would move with all the power that I had and put all my chips in, and they had to be prepared to resist that effort. And that's what we did in the 64 Act.
After 64, just a year later, you put your full weight behind another historic measure, and that was the Voting Act of 1965, Voting Rights Act of 1965, which provided direct federal action in order to help the blacks register and vote. Could you start from the beginning and tell us about the evolution of that act and getting it through just a year after the '64 victory?
I think it was a part of a philosophy that I had of the presidency. I wasn't sure that I would run for re-election in '64. When I decided I would run and did run and was elected, I realized that a president's time is limited, regardless of how big a mandate he may have received. So after the '64 election, I said to the people associated with me, we got to make up our mind what the big problems of this country are and do what we can about them in cooperation with the Congress and get that legislation through in a period of relatively few months, because as things go on, we won't have the support of the country that we have in November '64. Voting Rights Act was one of the things that needed doing. Poverty and health and Medicaid and all those things made up a part of the program. And I called down the congressional leadership and said, we feel that we ought to have this legislation, that now is the time that we can pass it, and I want to review it with you, explain it all to you, ask for your help and cooperation, and if you feel that you want to invite me to come to the Congress to deliver this message in person, I'll do it. If you don't, I will send it up by message. The leadership discussed it thoroughly and extended me an invitation, and I went there, and sometime in March, as I recall. Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. There is no reason which can excuse the denial of that right. There is no duty which weighs more heavily on us than the duty we have to ensure that right. And over the evolution of 3 or 4 months, we were able to get that rather strong bill passed in the House, and in the Senate, Senator Dirksen, as you know, supported us in the final days and made effective speeches and voted for cloture, and we put that landmark legislation on the statute books. I doubt that we could have done that in '67 as things went on and divisions came about. We hit while the iron was hot, and we made much progress.
Do you think the divisions of the Vietnam War did bring a halt to any hope of consensus on these domestic issues?
No. A great many of our better pieces of domestic legislation were the product of the Congress of 1968. And 68 was one of our more productive years. I was given everything I asked for in Vietnam in the way of men, in the way of authority, in the way of appropriations, and it was anguish for all of us. The people that felt that what I was doing was not right, they suffered to have to criticize me and to find fault with what we were doing, and I suffered to have to listen to them and try to find a better course and never to really find the right answer. We had many, many disappointments, but I never lacked authority, and I never lacked appropriations, and I never lacked a majority support in either house, or I felt in the country of my programs. And I think a president must have those things if he's going to be a good president. He can't have a Congress going one direction and the judiciary another and the executive another. It's just like the pilot of a plane going this way and the co-pilot going this way. And I never had that problem, and I'm grateful for it.
I'd like to ask you about Selma, the march organized by Martin Luther King from Selma to Montgomery protesting how difficult it was for blacks to vote at that period. In the middle of the crisis in Selma, you went on television. Your staff, we gather, advised against it. And the result was that "we shall overcome" speech to the Congress.
What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is the effort of American Negroes to secure for themselves the full blessings of American life. Their cause must be our cause too, because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
What was the reaction of that, to that speech? Because this moved you really into the camp with the protesters.
I think that when a president exercises leadership that he believes he must exercise, that he feels is necessary for the country, that he looks at his people and tells them this is the course of action that is just and fair and this is what I'm going to do, I think the reaction is generally good, and it was then. And of course, I was not without criticism from many sources in many places. But I'm glad I did what I did, and I think it was helpful to the course that we pursued and the laws we enacted subsequently.
Could you tell us about the decisions that went into the appointment of the first Negro ever to the U.S. Supreme Court, Thurgood Marshall?
Yes, I had met Justice Marshall when he was a lawyer for the NAACP, and I had not had an intimate relationship, but I knew him. When I became president, he was on the federal bench in New York. I looked over the country to attempt to find a person to be Solicitor General who would argue the cases before the Supreme Court. I also knew that there'd never been a black on the Supreme Court in this country. There'd never been a black in the cabinet of this country. And I didn't feel that was just. And I sent for him and told him, if you resign the federal judgeship, you give up a lifetime job. The job I'm offering you is a temporary job. If I'm, something happens to me, you'll be out of a job the next morning. Another administration, you'll be out of a job. But I would like for you to be my Solicitor General if you feel that you can be available for that assignment. He said, yes, Mr. President, I am available. I'll resign, and I'll be ready whenever you ask me. He came there, and he discharged his duties as Solicitor General well. I never mentioned the Supreme Court to him. When it became possible for me to appoint him on the Supreme Court, I called him and asked him to come to my office quietly the next day and to tell no one. I wanted to counsel with him on a matter, and he courteously agreed to be there at 10 o'clock. Whatever time I set the appointment, he came in, sat down, and I told him that I had this problem of selecting a man to the Supreme Court, and that I had had him in mind. And I said, I'm going to send your nomination to the Senate if it's agreeable to you. And he said, yes, it was. He said, you told me not to say anything about this to anyone. And said, before you do, I think I ought to tell you something. And my heart almost stopped beating because I was afraid there's going to be some problem of some kind. But he said, you told me not to discuss this with anyone else, this conference. But said, I just couldn't contain myself. I had to tell my wife. When the president calls up and asks to see a man, he just can't be expected to keep that from everyone. And I had to tell her. And said, now that you've given me this great honor, could I be excused long enough to just call her and tell her that what has happened? And I asked that they get Ms. Marshall on the phone. The White House operator got her on the phone. I asked him to pick it up. And he said hello and be sure that Miss Marshall's on the other end. And she said, honey, did we make it? And all the feeling that I thought I had contained must have been present there all those years, and they must have at least had the silent hope that if any black ever made the Supreme Court, he would make it. I've always felt very warm toward Ms. Marshall, because I think that Lady Bird must have felt that way many times in critical crisis that I was confronted with. She would say, honey, did we make it? And there was a team, but the pride that really came to me was here was a qualified man who had done so much for his people and so much for his country that finally, on the basis of merit, could be nominated and confirmed by the Senate. And that last is not an easy job for any man that's nominated for the Supreme Court.
In 1965, in an eloquent speech at Howard University, you apparently took a new tack. You said,
but freedom is not enough. You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying now, you are free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him. Thus, it is not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates.
how did you come to believe that the country was ready for that new move forward in the civil rights approach?
The country said that we want you to vote, we want you to eat any place you want to, and we want you to sleep any place, any public establishment if you want to. We want you to have equality in jobs, and in many ways we improved our education, health, and welfare systems where more equal justice was being dispensed. But all those things don't do any good. It doesn't do you any good to have a job if you're not qualified to hold it. It doesn't do you any good to have the right to build a house if you don't have the money to build it. It doesn't do you any right to have the right to go into the Hilton Hotel in New York if you haven't got the money to pay the rent on the building. All of those things are not worth much to you unless you have the economic resources and the preparation.
Mr. President, the statement is frequently made about that period in our national history, indeed going right up to today, is that perhaps in your zeal to do something for the blacks of this country and the other underprivileged, you had promised so much, and the delivery was difficult. Do you think that you overpromised?
No, I don't think. I don't know what we promised. We had certain goals, and we made certain recommendations, and we asked the Congress to do certain things, but I'm unaware of a lot of promises that we made that were not fulfilled.
Well, I think that when they speak of promises, not specifically political or legislative promises, but the promise of a better life, and that perhaps they believed that this was going to come with the passage of legislation and not over a longer period of time.
Practically the entire substance of the Johnson administration was organized and prepared and recommended more than 20 years before by another president. Lyndon Johnson was not the first president to recommend federal aid to education. Harry Truman had a group that studied it, and Harry Truman asked the Congress to give him educational legislation. Lyndon Johnson was not the man to recommend Medicare. Harry Truman recommended Medicare and was called a socialist and a communist and everything else. So, in this country, long before Lyndon Johnson came into a position of power, our leaders were recommending great advances in the field of civil rights and great advances in the field of health and education and environment and consumer legislation, and space and things of that nature. I just happened to be the catalyst and happened to be there at the time and with the support and with the approval of nearly everyone in the country that put them on the statute books. We passed 440 major pieces of legislation in the 6 years. And a great many people did say that we went too far and we went too fast. And well, we might have. But the country was long overdue. We'd had a good many administrations where they hadn't been able to achieve these things. But in this country, we always, it seems, there's a long lapse between the time something's proposed and something's disposed.
Well, now, in your book, you say that the Democrats lost in '68 because they had gone too far and too fast, and the blue-collar worker felt that the Democratic Party had traded his welfare for the welfare of the black man.
Well, I don't really think that we lost in '68 for any one single reason. The blue-collar worker thinking that the black man had, I think all of those were dissatisfactions that we had in the populace. I don't think you can take any one thing and point to what makes a man president by a change of 250,000 votes out of many millions. But I think that the Democratic candidate had dissatisfaction in those fields.
You think that the blue-collar worker has...
others.
You think the blue-collar worker has been lost to the Democrats, though, because of this pressure for...
No, I think the blue-collar worker, all the workers are the backbone of the Democratic Party. And times they get disgruntled, dissatisfied with high prices and not quite as high a rise in wages and things of that kind, and they express themselves, and they have a right to and ought to.
Now, we've touched on all of the bills, or most of them, in the civil rights area, except the last one, which touches most directly on this matter of blue-collar worker resentment, perhaps, and that's housing. In '66 and '67, we introduced a bill for non-discrimination in rental and sale of housing. It was defeated. You brought it back, and again in '68, and again, I gather you didn't think that there was very much support for it, but it was something you had to do. With all the evidence pointing the other way, after 2 defeats, and now as a lame duck president, you said you weren't going to run again. Why did you think you were going to be able to get it through that time?
Well, I wasn't sure. The meeting we had with the blacks, they wanted me to issue an executive order and proclaim this by presidential edict. I didn't think it would be very effective if the Congress had not legislated, and I didn't want to be a Hitler and start running the government by executive order. And I took the position that it wouldn't be wise to do it by executive order. It would arouse the antagonism of the Congress and the leadership of the people, and it wouldn't be followed. Difficult enough to follow it if you have the law of the land. And most of the leaders felt that they couldn't get the law, and they'd like to get part of a loaf by executive order, get what they could. One of those leaders agreed with me that we ought to go the legislative route, and that was Clarence Mitchell, and he stood up and said that if I would recommend it to the Congress and support it, that he thought that was a route we should follow. And anyway, that was a route that I was determined to follow, so I made the recommendation, and we passed the Equal Housing Act of '68 after I'd announced that I would not accept the nomination.
At the recent symposium, Barbara Jordan, the newly elected congresswoman from Houston, whom you of course know very well, said that the South would ultimately be more open to racial justice than the North. Do you believe that?
I think it's a problem for all of America that knows no region. I don't think prejudice is a matter of geography. I think we have it everywhere, and we have ample quantities of it in degrees that we ought to be ashamed of. Sometimes it's because of color, and sometimes it's because of literacy, and sometimes it's because of something you don't control at all. But we're living in a fast age, and all of us are rather impatient. And more important, we're rather intolerant of the opinions of our fellow man and his judgments and his conduct and his traditions and his way of life. And America was supposed to be the happy hunting ground for people of all religions and all faiths that could live life according to the dictates of their own conscience and their own choice, as long as they didn't basically interfere with the rights of another man. But to deny that there is prejudice in the country just makes the wrong bigger, because we know it's here, and the quicker we get at it, just like getting at heart disease or cancer, anything else, the better off we'll be. And I think we're making a good progress.
Mr. President, you said in that quite lovely speech at the library, and I do believe you have told me in private that you were feeling poorly, and but you didn't feel you could let your friends leave that hall without saying a word to them. You did speak to them, and you said some quite eloquent things. One of them you said,
to be black in a white society is not to stand on level and equal ground.
was a phrase that just came to you at that moment, or is that something that you've had as kind of a credo in the years?
No, I think it's a fact. I think we assume that because a lot of our documents say all men are created equal, stand side by side, we have kidded ourselves in believing that that's actually a fact, just like the Emancipation Proclamation is a proclamation, but it's not a fact, and it's not a fact that we stand on equal ground and stand side by side. One stands in an elevated position with all the advantages the country gives him, and the other one stands down in the rut, neglected and overlooked, and enjoyed second-rate facilities and housing and jobs and schools and health and everything else during our entire governmental existence. And we've begun to do something about it, but unless we recognize the fact that one's on the hill and the other's in the hollow, or one's on the mountain, the other's in the ditch, we're not evaluating it properly, and if we don't evaluate the problem properly, we can't solve the problem.
This second thing you said there that was a little more pragmatic, perhaps, involved the blacks and the present administration. You told them to go and see Mr. Nixon, to ask him to set aside an hour to talk, and they don't need to start off by saying he's terrible because he doesn't think he's terrible, when you put it. Do you think that if they ask, they can get that time to talk to the president?
Yes, I think so, although I'm not making the president's appointment. I have no authority to speak for him. I want to make that clear. I think that it's just the wise thing for all of us to do who are interested. I think we ought to go to the leadership of the Congress and say to them, here is a big problem that represents a cancer on the society of this country, and we want to do something about it, and here's what we think ought to be done, 1, 2, 3, and here's the way to go about it. Here's the legislation. As they have done with the civil rights conferences in past years. And then I think if they don't have the answer that they think is fair and just, that they have a right to call the president's people and say, we would like to talk to some of you in the White House about this, get you evaluated, and if it can't be corrected, we want to go all the way to a higher appeal to the highest officer of the land, the president himself. Now, I don't think you're going to be very effective if you say the Congress is no good and antiquated and ought to get out of the way, and the cabinet officer is dishonest and they won't do anything about it, and the president can't read and write and he's no good, because none of those people You can't sell them that argument. They don't believe that. They think they are good and they're doing the best they can. They want to do what's right. And I found a lot of times that my viewpoint was helped a great deal, and that I was strengthened in the decisions I made by what I learned by people who came to see me, and I wasn't always anxious to see all of them and sought advice, but I think it'd be helpful to both groups. And the president's a good listener. All of them haven't been. Some of them thought I didn't listen enough, but if they'd count the hours that I had people speak to me, I'm grateful for those hours. I learned from them.
At the very end of that speech here in Austin, I think you repeated a memorable phrase that you'd used before in Congress in '65.
We have proved that great progress is possible. We know how much still remains to be done. And if our efforts continue, and if our will is strong, and if our hearts are right, and if courage remains our constant companion, then, my fellow Americans, I am confident we shall overcome.
Well, Mr. President, do you think that on this great, still unresolved issue of civil rights, we shall overcome?
I certainly do.
Thank you, Mr. President.